Sufism, A Brief Historical Introduction by Lacy and Reynold Nicholson. Edited and selected by David Christopher Lane. Sufism, Lacy O'Leary, D.D., lecturer in Aromatic and Syriac, Bristol University. Sufism, or Islamic mysticism, which becomes prominent in the course of the 3rd century AH, was partly a product of Hellenistic influences and exercised a considerable influence on the philosophers of the time of Ibn Sina and afterwards. The name Sufi is derived from suf, wool, and so means wool-clad, thus denoting a person who from choice used clothing of the simplest kind and avoided every form of luxury or ostentation. That this is the true meaning is proved by the fact that Persian employs as its equivalent the term pashmina push, which also means wool-clad. By a popular error, the Arabic writers on Sufism often treat the word as derived from safa, purity, and so make it something akin to Puritan. And still more incorrectly, certain Western writers have supposed that it is a transliteration of the Greek sophos. The emphasis is laid upon the ascetic avoidance of luxury and the voluntary adoption of simplicity in clothing on the part of those to whom the term is applied. If we regard this as a form of asceticism, it will be at once objected that asceticism has no place in the teaching of the Quran and is alien to the character of early Islam. In a sense, this is true, and in a sense untrue, according to the meaning we attach to the term asceticism. As it is used in the history of Christian monasticism, or of the devotees of several Indian religions, or even of the latter Sufis, it implies a deliberate avoidance of the normal pleasures and indulgences of human life, and especially of marriage, as things which entangle the soul and prevent its spiritual progress. In this sense, asceticism is alien to the spirit of Islam, and appears amongst Muslims only as an exotic. But the term may be used, not very accurately perhaps, of the puritanical restraint and simplicity which avoids all luxury and display, and deliberately tries to retain a primitively simple and self-denying manner of life. In this latter sense of asceticism or Puritanism was a distinguishing mark of the old believer, as contrasted with the secularized Arab of the Umayyad type. And this attitude always had its admirers. The historians constantly refer with commendation to the abstemious lives of the early caliphs and the companions of the Prophet, and describe how they were abstinent not from poverty, but in order to put themselves on an equality with their subjects, and to preserve the traditional mode of life of the Prophet and his first followers. And very often in the recognized traditions we find mention of the bare and simple mode of life of the first Muslims. Quite early this simplicity appears as the distinctive mark of the strict Muslim, and emphasizes the difference between him and the worldly followers of the Umayyads, and similar instances appear amongst the devout Muslims of the present day. Such were not Sufis, but they may be regarded as the precursors of the Sufis. The historian Al-Fakhri, describing the abstemious life of the first caliphs, says that they endeavored by this self-restraint to wean themselves from the lusts of the flesh. This is reading a later idea into a much earlier practice, which was originally designed simply as a more accurate following of the Prophet, who was unable to enjoy any luxury or splendor, but it shows that later generations were inclined to ascribe a more definitely ascetic motive to the affectedly simple life of the earlier Muslims, and no doubt that early Puritanism, misunderstood by later ages, contributed to spread asceticism. Al-Kashiri, after referring to the companions and followers of the first age of Islam, then mentions the ascetics, or devotees, as the elect of a latter age, those who were most deeply concerned with matters of religion, and finally the Sufis as those elect of still latter times, whose souls were set on God, and who guarded their hearts from the disasters of heedlessness. Historically, this is an error, for the saints of early Islam were inspired by a spirit of strict adherence to the traditional life of their desert ancestors, and rejected luxury as an innovation. Very much the same spirit as that observed in the ancient Hebrew prophets, whilst the Sufis were no enthusiasts for tradition, but eschewed bodily indulgence as an entanglement of the flesh, which hindered the progress of the spirit, so that they were in no sense the successors of the companions, but were influenced by new ideas unknown to early Islam. Yet superficially the results were very much alike, and this caused the two to be connected, and helped the later custom of connecting the early Puritans with the ascetics of a subsequent age. In its earlier form, also, Islam made a strong appeal to the motive of fear, an appeal not based on divine severity so much as on divine justice and on man's consciousness of his own sinfulness and unworthiness, and on the fleeting passage of the life lived in this present world. There was an intense concentration on the day of judgment and on the perils of the sinner, a teaching which is perceived in the Quran even by the most casual reader. But all this was not altogether congenial to the Arab, although he in poetry certainly inclined towards a tone of sadness. The inevitable result of this teaching was asceticism in the puritanical sense, or perhaps we should say, a tone of severity in religion. Jami, one of the greatest Persian authorities on Sufism, tells us that the name Sufi was first applied to Abu Hashim, d. 162, an Arab of Kufa who spent the greater part of his life in Syria, and is typical of the early Islamic devotee who followed the simplicity of the Prophet's life and was deeply influenced by the Quranic teaching about sin, judgment, and the brief passage of earthly life. Similar devotees, claimed as Sufis by later Sufi writers, but more properly devotees who were their precursors, appear in the course of the 2nd century, such as Ibrahim b. Adham, d. 162, Daoud of Tay, d. 165, Fadail of Iyad, d. 188, Maruf of Kark, d. 200, and others, both men and women. Amongst these there was gradually evolved the beginnings of an ascetic theology in traditional sayings and narratives of their lives and conduct, a hagiology which lays great emphasis upon their penances and self-mortification. Of this material, the most important is the recorded teachings of Maruf of Kark, from which we may quote the definition of Sufism as the apprehension of divine realities, which, in a slightly altered sense perhaps, becomes the keynote of later Sufism. Can we trace the origin of these early recluses? Von Kremer considers this type as a native Arab growth developed from pre-Islamic Christian influences. Christian monasticism, we know, was familiar to the Arabs in the country fringing the Syrian desert and the desert of Sinai. Of this we have evidence both in Christian writers like Nilus and in the pre-Islamic poets, as in the words of Imru Lakace. Friend, see the lightning, it flashed and is gone, like the flashing of two hands on a crowned pillar. Did this blaze flash forth, or was it the lamp of the monk who poured oil on its twisted wick? The hermit's life was known even in Arabia itself, and tradition relates that Muhammad received his first call when he had retired to the cave of Hira and was living as a recluse there, returning periodically to his home and taking back food with him to the cave. It seems likely, indeed, that the early recluses of Islam were inspired by the example of Christian monasticism, either directly or through the medium of Muhammad's traditional retirement. But these recluses were not numerous, and admittedly neglect to Quranic command to marry. Thus, the earlier asceticism shows the character of devout quietism, of a puritanical abstinence from display of wealth and from self-indulgence, of a strict simplicity of life rather than of a voluntary poverty and mortification, of occasional retirement from the world, and only in rare instances of the permanent adoption of the hermit life. An instance of this type occurs in Abu Labas Asabti, d. 184, son of the Caliph Harunu ar-Rashid, who renounced rank and fortune for a life of meditation and retirement. In the latter part of the 3rd century, we begin to find evidences of a new Sufism, which was inspired by religious ideals other than those which had been dominant in early Islam, and which developed from those ideals a theology of its own, which for a long time was not admitted as orthodox. Asceticism still occurs, but whilst, on the one hand, it begins to take a more definite character in the deliberate seeking of poverty and mortification, it is, on the other hand, relegated to a subordinate place as a merely preparatory stage in the Sufi life, which is technically described as a journey. Poverty, which amongst the early Muslims was esteemed simply insofar as it reproduced the modest life of the Prophet and his companions, and was a standing protest against the secularization of the Umayyads, now assumed greater prominence as a devotional exercise, a change which appears definitely in Daoud at-Ta'id, d. 165, who limited his possessions to a rush mat, a brick which he used as a pillow, and a leather water bottle. In later Sufism, poverty takes a position of great prominence. The term fakir, poor man, and darwish, mendicant, become synonyms for Sufi. But in Sufi teaching, religious poverty does not mean absence of possessions only. It implies the absence of all interest in earthly things, the giving up of all participation in earthly possessions, and desiring God as the only aim of desire. So mortification is the subjugation of the evil part of the animal soul, the nafs, which is the seat of the lust and passions, and so the weaning of the soul from material interests, a dying to self and to the world, as a beginning of a living to God. What was the source of the theology developed in the newer Sufism? Undoubtedly, this was Neoplatonic, as has been proved by Dr. Nicholson. Selected poems from the Diwan of Shams-e, Cambridge, 1898, and The Mystics of Islam, London, 1914, and by Professor Brown, Literary History of Persia, London, 1902, Chapter 13. And forms part of the influence which came into Islam at the introduction of Greek philosophy under the Abbasids. But as in philosophy and other cultural transmissions, direct Greek influence was preceded by an indirect influence brought to bear through Syriac and Persian. So it was also in Neoplatonic theology, for Neoplatonic influences had already been brought to bear upon the Syrians and Persians in the pre-Islamic period. In the forefront of the later direct influence must be placed the so-called theology of Aristotle, which it is to no exaggeration to describe as the most prominent and the widest circulated manual of Neoplatonism which has ever appeared. It is, as we have already stated, an abridged translation of the last 3 books of Plotinus's Enneads. Now, the mysticism of Plotinus is philosophical and not religious, but it lends itself to a theological interpretation very easily, just as Neoplatonism as a whole very readily became a theological system in the hands of Jamblichus, of the pagans of Haran, and such like. And the Sufis were inclined to make this application, whilst the philosopha confined themselves to its philosophical side. It seems probable that the influence of the Pseudo-Dionysius was brought to bear upon Islam about the same time. The Pseudo-Dionysian writings consist of 4 treatises, of which 2 are treatises on mythological theology in 5 chapters, and a treatise on the names of God in 13 chapters, have been the chief source of Christian mystical theology. The first reference to these writings occurs in AD 532, when the claim was made that they were the work of Dionysius, the Areopagite, a pupil of St. Paul, or at least represent his teaching. In several places, the writer cites Hierotheus as his teacher, and this enables us to identify the source as a Syrian monk named Stephen Bar Sudaili, who wrote under the name Hierotheus. This Bar Sudaili was abbot of a convent at Edessa, and was involved in controversy with James of Sarug, so that we may refer the writings to the latter part of the 5th century A.D. They were translated into Syriac very soon after their first appearance in Greek, and, as familiar to Syriac Christians, must have become indirectly known to the Muslims. We have no direct evidence as to their translation into Arabic, but Mai gives fragments of other works of Bar Sudaili which appear in Arabic MSS. In his Spicilegium Romanum, the traditional view of the relations between Sufism and philosophy is described in the anecdotes cited by Professor Brown. Literary History of Persia from Akhlaq-e-Jalali. Of the Sufi Abu Sa'id B. Abi el-Khair, 1049 A.D., who is said to have met and conversed with Ibn Sina. When they parted, Abu Sa'id said of Ibn Sina, "What I see, he knows," whilst Ibn Sina said, "What I know, he sees." But there were other influences of a secondary character at work in Iraq and Persia, which became important when we remember that it was the subject population of those parts which had, to a large extent, replaced the Arabs as the leaders of Islam during the Abbasid period. In connection with the Sufis, probably we cannot refer to any influence to the Zoroastrian religion proper, which had non-ascetic and national character, but the Manichaean and Maskadite religions. The two free churches of Persia show a definitely ascetic tone, and when we find, as is the case, that many of the early Sufis were converts from Zoroastrianism, or the sons of such converts, we are inclined to subject that, though professing that recognized religion, they were probably, in all probability, actually Zindiqs, secretly heretics and initiates of the Manichaean and Maskadite sect, making external profession of the more recognized cult, as was the common practice of these Zindiqs. Note must also be made of the Gnostic influences transmitted through the Saniya of the Fen country between Wasit and Basra, the Mandanaeans as they are called to distinguish them from the so-called Sabians of Haran. The Sufi Maruf of Kark was himself the son of Sabian parents. And again, we must not ignore the probability of Buddhist influences, for Buddhist propaganda had been active in pre-Islamic times in eastern Persia and Transoxiana. Buddhist monasteries existed in Balkh, and it is noteworthy that the Ascete Ibrahim B. Adham, d. 162, cf. Supra, is traditionally described as a prince of Balkh, who left his throne to become a darwish. On closer examination, however, it does not appear that Buddhist influences can have been very strong, as there are essential differences between Sufi and Buddhist theories. A superficial resemblance exists between the Buddhist nirvana and the fana, or reabsorption of the soul in the divine spirit of Sufism. But the Buddhist doctrine represents the soul as losing its individuality in the passionless placidity of absolute quiescence, whilst the Sufi doctrine, through also teaching a loss of individuality, regards everlasting life as consisting in the ecstatic contemplation of the divine beauty. There is an Indian parallel to fana, but it is not in Buddhism, but in the Vedantic pantheism. It is generally accepted that the first exponent of Sufi doctrine was the Egyptian or Nubian Du en Nun, d. 245 to 246, a pupil of the jurist Malik B. Anas, who lived at the time when there was much percolation of Hellenistic influence into the Islamic world. He was indeed nearly contemporary with Abdullah, the son of Maymum, whose work we have already noticed. Du en Nun's teaching was recorded and systematized by Al-Junayd of Baghdad, d. 297, and in it appears essential doctrine of Sufism. As of all mysticism, in the teaching of Tawhid, the final union of the soul with God, a doctrine which is expressed in a way closely resembling the Neoplatonic teaching, save that in Sufism, the means whereby this union is to be attained is not by the exercise of the intuitive faculty of reason, but by piety and devotion. Still, the two come very close when we find in the teachings of later philosophers that the highest exercise of reason consists in the intuitive apprehension of the external verities, rather than in any other activity of the intellect. Al-Junayd is stated by Jami to have been Persian, and it is chiefly in Persian hands that the doctrines of Sufism develop and turn towards pantheism. Both agnosticism and pantheism are present practically in the later Neoplatonism. Agnosticism as regards the unknowable first cause, the God from the agent intellect, is an emanation, a doctrine which develops in the teaching of the philosophers and of the Ismailians and kindred sects. But Sufi teaching centers its attention upon the knowable God, which the philosopher would describe as the agent intellect, or logos, and this develops more usually in a pantheistic direction. The doctrines thus developed and expressed by Al-Junayd were boldly preached by his pupil, Ash-Shibli of Khorasan, d. 335. Al-Hussein b. Mansur al-Hallaj, d. 309, was a fellow student of Ash-Shibli, and shows Sufism is allied with extremely unorthodox elements. He was of Zoroastrian descent and closely in touch with the Qarmatians, and seems to have held those doctrines which are usually associated with the Gulat or extreme Shiites, such as transmigration, incarnation, etc. He was put to death as a heretic for declaring, "I am the truth," thus identifying himself with God. The accounts given of him show great differences of opinion. For the most part, the early historians, approaching the subject from an orthodox standpoint, represent him as a wily conjurer who, by pretended miracles, gained a number of adherents, but later Sufi writers regard him as a saint and martyr who suffered because he disclosed the great secret of the union between the soul and God. The doctrine of hulul, or incarnation of God in the human body, was one of the cardinal tenets of the Gulat. According to Al-Hallaj, man is essentially divine because he was created by God in his own image, and that is why, in Quran 2:32, God bids the angels worship Adam. In hulul, which is treated as Tawhid taking place in this present life, the deity of God enters the human soul in the same way that the soul at birth enters the body. This teaching is a fusion of the old pre-Islamic Persian beliefs as to incarnation and the philosophical theories of Neoplatonism, of the intellect or rational soul or spirit, as it is more commonly called by English writers. The part added to the animal soul is an emanation from the agent intellect, to which it will ultimately return and with which it will be united. C.F. Messinian, Kitab al-Tawassun, Paris, 1913. This is an extremely interesting illustration of the fusion of Oriental and Hellenistic elements in Sufism, and shows that the theoretical doctrines of Sufism, whatever they may have borrowed from Persia and India, receive their interpretative hypotheses from Neoplatism. It is interesting also as shewing in the person of Al-Hallaj a meeting point between the Sufi and the philosopher of the Ismailian school. Very similar was the teaching of Abu Yazid or Bayazid of Bistam, d. 260, who was also of Zoroastrian descent. The pantheistic element is very clearly defined. God, he said, is an unfathomable ocean. He himself was the throne of God, the preserved tablet, the pen, the word, all images taken from the Quran, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Gabriel. For all who obtain true being are absorbed into God and become one with God. Pantheistic views and the doctrine of hulul occur frequently in Sufi teaching, but they are by no means universal. Indeed, we cannot make any accurate statement of Sufi doctrine in detail, but only of general principles and tendencies. The Sufis do not form a sect, but are simply devotees of mystical tendencies spread through all the branches of the Muslim community. In the 3rd century, they are most prominent amongst the Shiites, and so Shiite views seem to be incorporated in Sufism, but they form no integral part of it. Precisely similar conditions occur in Christianity, where mysticism has flourished in the extremer Protestant sects as well as in the contemplative orders of the Catholic Church, and, in spite the theological differences, has a very considerable amount of common material. Only it must be noted that no basis of mysticism exists unless such relations between the human soul and God are presupposed, as are suggested by Neoplatonism. Christian mysticism, in the true sense, does not begin in the West until the works of the Pseudo-Dionysius were translated into Latin in the 9th century A.D., and Muslim mysticism dates from the translation of the theology of Aristotle. On the other hand, it must also be noted that mysticism exercises a strong modifying influence on theology generally. The tendency of mysticism is towards a latitudinarian type. It is consequently opposed consciously or unconsciously to definite dogmatic teaching, and so to speculative theology and philosophy. Superficially, Muslim mysticism seems to be organized like a sect. Reference is often made to the various grades of Sufis, but these are not official grades like those of the Ismailians and similar bodies, but denote successive stages on the path of personal holiness. It is no more than fanciful terminology, perhaps borrowed from some of the sects because it seems that Sufism flourished earliest and most freely in some of the extremer Shiite groups. It was, and is, most usual for the beginner in the path of holiness to put himself under the direction of some experienced spiritual guide, who acts as a teacher, and is known as sheikh, murshid, or pir. In many cases, this pupillage involves absolute and blind obedience to the teacher, because the renunciation of personal wishes and inclinations and all that can be described as self-will is one of the forms of abnegation required of those who seek to be weaned from earthly interests. From the grouping of devotees around some prominent teacher has arisen the foundation of Darwish confraternities, sometimes as sodalities of laymen who pursue their secular occupations and meet from time to time for religious exercises and instruction, and sometimes as permanent communities living in strict obedience under a sheikh. Traces of such monastic institutions appear in Damascus around 150 AH, and in Khorasan some 50 years later. None of the existing orders of Islam, however, seem to be of so early date. We hear of a Sheikh Alwan, circa 149, whose shrine is at Jeddah, and who is the reputed founder of the Alwaniya community, a body now existing only as a subdivision of the Rifa'ite order. There are also orders known as the Adamiya, Bastamiya, and Sakatiya, which trace their origin to Ibrahim B. Adham, to Bayazid Bastami, and to Sari Sakati, respectively, but whose real origin is uncertain. In the 6th century, we are on surer ground. There is no reason to question the claim of the Rifa'ite order to trace its foundations to Abu el-Abbas Ahmad b. Ali el-Hassan Ali ibn Abi el-Abbas Ahmad Rifa'i, d. 578, a native of the village of Abida, near the junction of the Tigris and Euphrates. In his lifetime, he gathered a large body of disciples, whom he incorporated in an order in 576, the members living in the community under a sheikh, to whom they owed unquestioning obedience, but having also, like other orders, a number of lay adherents. Dying without issue, the headship of his order passed to his brother's family. It exists today in two main branches. One, the Al-Hwaniya, already mentioned, and two, the Jibawi, who are best known from their association with the ceremony of the Dawsa, at which the sheikh used to ride over the prostrate bodies of his followers. Of all the orders now flourishing in Egypt, it is the one most inclined to fanatical observances at its zikr, or prayer meeting. The members cutting themselves, driving sharp skewers and knives into their bodies, swallowing snakes, etc., and in prayer allowing the name of God oft-repeated to become at last no more than a half-articulate groan. They are usually distinguished by black turbans. The Qadiriyya claim Abdul al-Qadir Jilani, d. 561, as their founder. At their zikir, there is none of the fire-eating, serpent-swallowing, self-mutilation of the Rifaites, but only the name of God is repeated, always clearly enunciated and followed by a pause. The Badawaya were founded by Abdul al-Fita Ahmad, d. 675, whose shrine is at Tanta in Lower Egypt. The zikir is of a sober kind, the divine name being repeated in a loud voice without cutting, fire-eating, etc. The Malawaya, or dancing darwishes, were founded by the Persian mystical poet Jalal ad-Din Rumi, the author of the poem known as the Masnawi. The Sherwadiyya trace their origin to Shihabu-ud-Din, a pantheistic Sufi of Baghdad, who was put to death by Saladin in 587. In each of these orders, a special course of instruction has taken a more or less conventional form, and there have been certain great teachers whose writings have come into use as manuals, and so have been impressed their views upon Sufism generally. Yet the fact remains that Sufi teaching is essentially eclectic, and can be formulated only in broad principles and tendencies. Of these, the following seem to be of most general application. 1. God alone exists. God is the only reality. All else is elusive. This is the Sufi rendering of the doctrine of the unity of God. Strictly speaking, God here signifies the agent intellect. That is to say, the revelation of God who in himself is unknowable. But the Sufi does not make this philosophical distinction clear, or else deliberately regards the revelation of God as God. But in man there is a rational soul, which is to God as a mirrored image of the object which it reflects, and is capable of approaching the divine reality. As other than God is merely elusive, it is obvious that a knowledge of God, the reality, cannot be attained by the medium of created things. And thus, the Sufis were led, like the Neoplatonists, to attach greater value to immediate intuition by the rational soul than to use arguments, and so to place direct revelation above what is ordinarily described as reason. This is a line of development common to all forms of mysticism, and results in a preference of ecstasy or similar spiritual existence above the record of past revelation as given in the Quran. The doctrine of ecstasy, or hal, or maqama, was first formulated by Du En Nun, and implies fana, or passing away, i.e. insensibility to things of this world, and finally, baka, or continuance in God. Usually, this experience is accompanied by loss of sensation, though this is not always the case, and there are many legends of Sufi saints which represent them as totally unconscious of violence of wounds, and this is not confined to legend, for most extraordinary sufferings are endured, apparently with perfect placidity, by darwishas at the present day, perhaps in accordance with psychological laws which are imperfectly understood, and this is the underlying idea in the exercises undergone by the Rifa-e-Darwishas and others. The exercise known as zikr, or remembering, in accordance with the command in Quran 33:41, remember God often, is an attempt to make an advance towards the ecstatic state. It was perhaps under Sufi influence that we find philosophy inclining to prefer knowledge obtained by immediate intuition. It was certainly under such influence that ecstasy is treated as a means of obtaining such direct apprehension of truth in the later philosophers. 2. The Sufi doctrine of God as the only reality has a direct bearing not only on creation, but also on the problem of good and evil. As a thing can only be known by its opposite, light by darkness, health by sickness, being by non-being, so God could only be made known to man as reality contrasted with non-reality. And the mingling of these two opposites produces the world of phenomena in which light is made known by a background of darkness, which darkness is itself only the absence of light, or as being proceeds by successive emanations from the first cause, and becomes weaker or less real in each emanation as it recedes further from the great reality. It incidentally becomes more perceptible as it becomes less real. Thus, evil, which is merely the negation of the moral beauty of the reality, appears in the latest emanation as the unreal background, which is the inevitable result of a projection of the emanation from the first cause, who is entirely good, into a world of phenomena. Evil is therefore not real. It is merely the result, the inevitable result, of the mingling of reality with unreality. In fact, this is implied in the doctrine that all other than God is unreal. 3. The aim of the soul is union with God. This doctrine of Tawheed, as we have seen, received early expression in Muslim mystic theology. Dr. Nicholson is of opinion that the Sufi conception of the passing away, fana, of the individual self in universal being is certainly of Indian origin. Its first great exponent was the Persian mystic Bayazid of Bistam, who may have received it of his teacher Abu Ali of Sind. But this is only one particular way of presenting a doctrine which has a much wider range and is present in all mystical teaching, including that of Neoplatonists. In the highest sense, it is the basis of Sufi ethics, for the summum bonum is defined as the union of the individual soul with God, and all is good which helps towards this, all is evil which retards it, and this is true of Christian and all other forms of mysticism equally. We cannot say definitely that the doctrine of the unitive state is borrowed from Neoplatonism, from Buddhism, or from Gnosticism. It is the common property of all, and is the natural conclusion from the mystics' premises as to the nature of God and of the human soul. It may well be that certain presentations of this doctrine show Indian details, but in this, as in all other parts of Sufi speculation, it seems that the constructive theory employed in forming a theological system was Neoplatonic. Even in mysticism, the Greek mind exercised its influence in analyzing and constructing hypotheses. At quite an early age, the soul's desire for union with its divine source began to be clothed in terms borrowed from the expression of human love. With some hesitation, we may say, perhaps, that this is distinctly Oriental, although it was so only as a means of expressing a desire which is characteristic of all mysticism. We find the same at a later period, though in a much more restrained fashion, in Christian mysticism, and it is not easy to see the actual line of contact, if any. Perhaps we must be content to regard it as independently developed as a means of expressing the soul's longing. The rise of Sufi teaching was not without opposition, and this was mainly on three grounds. 1. The Sufis advocated constant prayer in the form of unceasing silent intercourse with God, and by this tended to discard the fixed salawat, or 5 obligatory prayers at appointed hours, one of the compulsory duties of Islam and one of its distinctive marks. Ultimately, the Sufi position was that these fixed ritual observances were for the people at large who had not made any advance in the deeper spiritual knowledge, but might be disregarded by those who were more mature in grace, a position which is closely parallel to that attained by the philosophers. 2. They introduced zikirs, or religious exercises, consisting in a continuous repetition of the name of God, a form of devotion unknown to older Islam, and consequently an innovation. And 3, many of them adopted the practice of tawakkul, or complete dependence on God, neglecting all kinds of labor or trade, refusing medical aid in sickness, and living on alms begged from the faithful. All of these were innovations and as such met with very definite opposition. Mostly, no doubt, because they were repugnant to the sober tone of traditional Islam, which has always been suspicious of Oriental fanaticism. The more serious objection, that it really dispensed with the religion of the Quran, is implied, if not expressed. It introduced an entirely new concept of God and a new standard of religious values. If Sufi ideas prevailed, the practices of the Muslim religion would be at best the tolerable and harmless usages of those who were not initiated into vital religion. In fact, however, the philosophical principles brought forward by the Neoplatonic Aristotelian works in general circulation were so far influential and regarded as reconcilable with the Quran that Sufism, insofar as it was Neoplatonic, did not appear to be destructive of Islam, but only at variance with customary usage. Nevertheless, Sufism was generally looked upon as heretical, not only from the innovations we have mentioned, but because of the close alliance between doctrines of its extremer advocates and those of the more advanced Shiites. It is indeed most significant that it developed chiefly amongst the same elements which gave the readiest hearing to philosophy, and still adhered to Zoroastrian and Masticite ideas. No doubt the ill repute of Sufism was largely due to the bad company it kept. It was not until the time of Al-Ghazali, d. 505, that Sufism began to take its place in Orthodox Islam. Al-Ghazali, left an orphan at an early age, had been educated by a Sufi friend, and, after becoming an Asharite, and as such acting as president of the Nazimite Academy at Baghdad, found himself in spiritual difficulties, and spent 11 years in retirement and in practices of devotion, with the result that when he returned to work as a teacher in 449, his instruction was strongly leavened by mysticism, practically a return to the principles he had been taught in his early years. As Al-Ghazali became, in course of time, the dominant influence in Muslim scholasticism, a modified and orthodox Sufism was introduced into Sunni theology and has since held its own. At the same time, he reduced Sufism to a scientific form and gave, or rather supported, a terminology derived from Plotinus. Such a Sufism may be described as Muslim mystic theology, purged of its Shiite accretions. This admission of modified Sufism into the Orthodox Church of Islam took place in the 6th century AH. In the following century, Sufism appeared in Spain, but there it arrived as transmitted through an Orthodox medium, and hence differs from Asiatic mysticism. The first Spanish Sufi seems to have been Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, d. 638, who traveled in Asia and died at Damascus. He was a follower of Ibn Hazm, who, as we shall see later, represents a system of jurisprudence of a type more reactionary even than that of Ibn Hanbal. In Spain itself, The leading Sufi was Abdu el-Haq ibn Sabin, d. 667, who shows the more characteristic Spanish attitude of a Sufi who was also a philosopher, for Spanish Sufism was essentially speculative. Like many other philosophers of the Muwahhid period, he adhered outwardly to the Zahirites, the most reactionary party of the narrowest orthodoxy. In the 7th century also we have Jalaluddin Rumi, d. 672, who practically completes the golden age of Sufism. Although a Persian, he was an Orthodox Sunni. He was a native of Balkh, but his father was compelled to leave that city and migrate westward and finally settled at Konya, Iconium, where he died. Jalaluddin had been educated by his father, and after his death he sought further instruction at Aleppo and Damascus, where he came under the influence of Burhanuddin of Termid, who had been one of his father's pupils and continued his training in Sufi doctrines. After this teacher's death, he came in touch with the eccentric but saintly Shams-e Tabriz, a man of great spiritual power, but illiterate, who left a great impress on his age by his tremendous spiritual enthusiasm and the strange crudity of his conduct and character. It was after the death of Shams-e Tabriz that Jalaluddin commenced his great mystical poem, the Masnawi, a work which has attained an extraordinary eminence and reverence throughout the whole of Turkish Islam. As already mentioned, Jalaluddin founded an order of darwishes known as the Malawi order, or dancing darwishes, as they are called by Europeans. The whole course of doctrinal Sufism begins with Du Nun and ends with Jalaluddin. Later writers do little more than repeat their teaching in new literary form, and it will be sufficient to select a few typical examples. In the 8th century, we have Abdul Razak, d. 730, a pantheistic Sufi who wrote commentary on and defended the teaching of Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. He advocated the doctrine of free will on the ground that the human soul is an emanation from God, and so shares the divine character. This world, he holds, is the best possible world. Differences in condition exist, and justice consists in accepting these and adapting things to their situation. Ultimately, all things will cease to exist as they are reabsorbed in God, the only reality. Men are divided into 3 classes. The first contains the men of the world, whose life centers in self and who are indifferent towards religion. A second class contains the men of the reason, who discern God intellectually by his external attributes and manifestations. And as a third class are the men of the spirit, who perceive God intuitively. Although Sufism has now taken a recognized place in the life of Islam, it was not allowed to pass without occasional challenge. The leading opponent was the Hanbalite reformer Ibn Taymiyyah, d. 728, who represented the reactionary but popular theology. He rejected formal adherence to any school, dismissed all importance attached to ijma or consensus, save that based on the agreement of the Prophet's companions. He denounced the scholastic theology of al-Ash'ari and al-Ghazali and defined the divine attributes on the lines laid down by Ibn Hazm. At that time, the Sufi an-Nasr al-Manbiji was prominent in Cairo, and to him Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a letter denouncing the Sufi doctrine of Ijtihad as heresy. From this arose the quarrel between the 2 rival forces of Islam, traditional orthodoxy and mysticism, in the course of which Ibn Taymiyyah suffered persecution and imprisonment. Towards the end of his life, in 726, he issued a fatwa, or declaration of opinion against the lawfulness of the reverence paid to the tombs of saints, and of the invocation of saints, the Prophet himself included. In this, he was the precursor of the Wahhabi Reformation of the 18th century AD, MSS, in which the works of Ibn Taymiyyah are copied out by the hand of Abdul Wahhab, who was evidently a close student of that reformer, all of whose theories he reproduces. Asharani of Cairo, d. 973, is typical of the later Orthodox Sufi. He was a follower of Ibn Arabi on general lines, but without his pantheism. His writings are a strange mixture of lofty speculation and lowly superstition. His life was full of intercourse with jinns and other supernatural beings. The truth, he states, is not to be reached by the aid of reason. The wali is the man who possesses the gift of illumination, ilham, or direct apprehension of the spiritual, but that grace differs from the inspirational, wahi, bestowed upon the prophets, and the wali must submit to the guidance of prophetic revelations. All walis are essentially under the kitab, but the kitab is inferior to the companions of Muhammad. Whatever rule tariqa or darwish follows, he is guided by God. But Ash-Sharani himself preferred the rule of Ajunaid. The varying opinions of the canonists are adapted to the differing needs of men. Ash-Sharani was the founder of a Darwish order which forms a subdivision of the Badawiya. His writings have considerable influence in modern Islam and form the program of those who advocate a neo-Sufi reformation. Sufism. Divine Love by Reynold Nicholson. Anyone acquainted, however slightly, with the mystical poetry of Islam must have remarked that the aspiration of the soul towards God is expressed, as a rule, in almost the same terms which might be used in an Oriental Anacreon or Herrick. The resemblance, indeed, is often so close that unless we have some clues to the poet's intention, we are left in doubt as to his meaning. In some cases, perhaps, the ambiguity serves as an artistic purpose, as in the odes of Hafiz, but even when the poet is not deliberately keeping his reader suspended between earth and heaven, it is quite easy to mistake a mystical hymn for a drinking song or a serenade. Ibn al-Arabi, the greatest theosophist whom the Arabs have produced, found himself obliged to write a commentary on some of his poems in order to refute the scandalous charge that they were designed to celebrate the charms of his mistress. Here are a few lines. Oh, her beauty, the tender maid, its brilliance gives light like lamps to one traveling in the dark. She is a pearl hidden in a shell of hair as black as jet. A pearl for which thought dives and remains unceasingly in the depths of that ocean. He who looks upon her deems her to be a gazelle of the sand hills, because of her shapely neck and the loveliness of her gestures. It has been said that the Sufis invented this figurative style as a mask for mysteries which they desired to keep secret. That desire was natural in those who proudly claimed to possess an esoteric doctrine known only to themselves. Moreover, a plain statement of what they believed might have endangered their liberties. But apart from any such motives, the Sufis adopt the symbolic style because there is no other possible way of interpreting mystical experience. So little does knowledge of the infinite revealed in ecstatic vision need an artificial disguise that it cannot be communicated at all except through types and emblems drawn from the sensible world, which, imperfect as they are, may suggest the shadow forth, a deeper meaning that appears on the surface. Gnostics, as Ibn al-Arabi, cannot impart their feelings to other men. They can only indicate them symbolically to those who have begun to experience the like. What kind of symbolism each mystic will prefer depends on his temperament and character. If he be a religious artist, a spiritual poet, his ideas of reality are likely to clothe themselves instinctively in forms of beauty and glowing images of human love. To him, the rosy cheek of the beloved represents the divine essence manifested through its attributes. Her dark curls signified the one veiled by the many. When he says, drink wine that it may set you free from yourself, he means lose your phenomenal self in the rapture of divine contemplation. I might fill pages with further examples. This erotic and Bacchanalian symbolism is not, of course, peculiar to the mystical poetry of Islam. But nowhere else is it displayed so opulently and in such perfection. It has been often misunderstood by European critics, one of whom even now can describe the ascetics of Sufis as inspired partly by wine and strongly tinged with sensuality. As regards the whole body of Sufis, the charge is altogether false. No intelligent and unprejudiced student of their writings could have made it, and we ought to have been informed on what sort of evidence it is based. There are black sheep in every flock, and amongst the Sufis we find many hypocrites, debauchees, and drunkards who bring discredit on the pure brethren. But it is just as unfair to judge Sufism in general by the excesses of these impostors as it would be to condemn all Christian mysticism on the ground that certain sects and individuals are immoral. God is the Saki, cupbearer, and the wine. He knows what matters of love is mine. Said Jalaluddin Ibn Arabi declares that no religion is more sublime than a religion of love and longing for God. Love is the essence of all creeds. The true mystic welcomes it wherever guise it may assume. My heart has become capable of every form. It is a pasture for gazelles and a covenant for Christian monks, and a temple for idols and the pilgrim's Kaaba, and the tables of the Torah and the book of the Quran. I follow the religion of love, whichever way his camels take. My religion and my faith is the true religion. We have a pattern in Bishr, the lover in Hind and her sister, and in Kays and Lubna, and in Maya and Gelan. Commenting on the last verse, the poet writes, love, love, is one of the same reality to those Arab lovers and to me. But the objects of our love are different, for they loved a phenomenon, whereas I love the real. They are a pattern to us because God only afflicted them with love for human beings in order that he might show, by means of them, the falseness of those who pretend to love him, and yet feel no such transport and rapture in loving him as deprived those enamored men of their reason and made them unconscious of themselves. Most of the great medieval Sufis lived saintly lives, dreaming of God, intoxicated with God. When they tried to tell their dreams, being men, they used the language of men. If they were also literary artists, they naturally wrote in the style of their own day and generation. In mystical poetry, the Arabs yield the palm to the Persians. Anyone who would read the secret of Sufism, no longer encumbered with theological articles nor obscured by metaphysical subtleties, let him turn to Attar Jalaluddin, Rumi, and Jami, whose works are partially accessible in English and other European languages. To translate these wonderful hymns is to break their melody and bring their soaring passion down to earth. But not even a prose translation can quite conceal the love of truth and the vision of beauty which inspired them. Listen again to Jalaluddin. He comes, a moon, whose like the sky ne'er saw, awake or dreaming, crowned with eternal flame, no flood can lay. Lo, from the flagon of thy love, O Lord, my soul is swimming, and ruined my body's house of clay. When first the giver of the grape my lonely heart befriended, wine fired my bosom, and my veins filled up.
But when his image all mine I possessed, a voice descended, "Well done, O sovereign wine and peerless cup." The love thus symbolized is the emotional element in religion, the rapture of the seer, the courage of the martyr, the faith of the saint, the only basis of moral perfection and spiritual knowledge. Practically, it is self-renunciation and self-sacrifice, the giving up of all possessions, wealth, honor, will, life, and whatever else men value, for the beloved's sake without any thought of reward. I have already referred to love as the supreme principle in Sufi ethics, and now let me give some illustrations. Love, says Jalaluddin, is the remedy of our pride and self-conceit, the physician of our infirmities. Only he whose garment is rent by love becomes entirely unselfish. Nuri, Rakam, and other Sufis were accused of heresy and sentenced to death. When the executioner reproached Rakam, Nuri rose and offered himself in his friend's place with the utmost cheerfulness and submission. All the spectators were astounded. The executioner said, "Young man, the sword is not a thing that people are so eager to meet, and your turn has not yet arrived." Nuri answered, "My religion is founded on unselfishness. Life is the most precious thing in the world. I wish to sacrifice for my brethren's sake the few moments which remain." On another occasion, Nuri was overheard praying as follows: "O Lord, in thy eternal knowledge and power and will, thou dost punish the people of hell whom thou hast created. And if it be thy inexorable will to make hell full of mankind, thou art able to fill it with me alone, and to send them to paradise." In his proportion as a Sufi loves God, he sees God in all his creatures, and goes forth to them in acts of charity. Pious works are not without love. Cheer one sad heart, thy loving deed will be more than 1,000 temples raised by thee. One freeman whom thy kindness hath enslaved outweighs by far 1,000 slaves set free.
The Muslim legend of the saints abounds in tales of pity shown to animals, including the despised dog, birds, and even insects. It is related that Bayezid purchased some cardamom seed at Hamadan, and before departing put into his gaberdine a small quantity which was left over. On reaching Bistam and recollecting what he had done, he took out the seed and found that it contained a number of ants. Saying, "I have carried the poor creatures away from their home," he immediately set off and journeyed back to Hamadan, a distance of several hundred miles. This universal charity is one of the fruits of pantheism. The ascetic view of the world which prevailed amongst the early Sufis, and their vivid consciousness of God as a transcendent personality rather than as an immanent spirit, caused them to crush their human affections relentlessly. Here's a short story from the life of Hudayi ibn Iyad. It would be touching if it were not so edifying.
One day he had in his lap a child of 4 years old, and chanced to give it a kiss, as it is the way of fathers. The child said, "Father, do you love me?" "Yes," said Hudayi. "Do you love God?" "Yes." "How many hearts have you?" "One." Then asked the child, "How can you love two with one heart?" Hudayi perceived that the child's words were divine admonition. In his zeal for God, he began to beat his head and repented with his love for the child, and gave his heart wholly to God. The higher Sufi mysticism, as represented by Jalaluddin Rumi, teaches that the phenomenal is a bridge to the real. Whether it be of this world or of that, thy love will lead thee yonder at the last. And Jami says in a passage which has been translated by Professor Brown, "Even from earthly love thy face avert not.
since to the real it may serve to raise these, ere A, B, C are rightly apprehended. How canst thou con the pages of thy Koran? A sage, so heard I, unto whom a student came craving counsel on the course before him, said, if thy steps be stranger to love's pathways, depart, learn love, and then return before me. For shouldst thou fear to drink wine from form's flagon, thou canst not drain the draught of the ideal. But yet beware, by not the form belated, strive rather with all speed the bridge to traverse. If to the bourne thou vain wouldst bear thy baggage, upon the bridge let not thy footsteps linger. Emerson sums up the meaning of this when he says, beholding in many souls the traits of the divine beauty, and separating in each soul that which is divine from the taint which it has contracted in the world, the lover ascends to the highest beauty, to the love and knowledge of the divinity, by steps on this ladder of created souls. Man's love of God, says Hujwiri, is a quality which manifests itself in the heart of the pious believer, and a form of veneration and magnification, so that he seeks to satisfy his beloved and becomes impatient and restless in his desire for vision of him, and cannot rest with anyone except him, and grows familiar with the recollection of him, and abjures the recollection of everything besides. Repose becomes unlawful to him, and rest flees from him. He is cut off from all habits and associations, and renounces sensual passion, and turns towards the court of love, and submits to the law of love, and knows God by his attributes of perfection. Inevitably, such a man will love his fellow men. Whatever cruelty they inflict upon him, he will perceive only the chastening hand of God, whose bitters are very sweets to the soul. Bayezid said that when God loves a man, he endows him with three qualities in token thereof: a bounty like that of the sea, a sympathy like that of the sun, and a humility like that of the earth. No suffering can be too great, no devotion too high, for the piercing insight and burning faith of a true lover. Ibn al-Arabi claims that Islam is peculiarly the religion of love, inasmuch as the Prophet Muhammad is called God's beloved, Habib. But though some traces of this doctrine occur in the Quran, its main impulse was unquestionably derived from Christianity. While the oldest Sufi literature, which is written in Arabic and unfortunately has come down to us in a fragmentary state, is still dominated by the Quranic insistence on fear of Allah, it also bears conspicuous marks of the opposing Christian tradition. As in Christianity, through Dionysius and other writers of the Neoplatonic school, so in Islam, and probably under the same influence, the devotional and mystical love of God soon developed into ecstasy and enthusiasm, which finds in the sensuous imagery of human love the most suggestive medium for its expression. Dr. Inge observes that the Sufis appear like true Asiatics to have attempted to give a sacramental and symbolic character to the indulgence of their passions. I need not again point out that such a view of genuine Sufism is both superficial and incorrect. Love, like gnosis, is in its essence a divine gift, not anything that can be acquired. If the whole world wished to attract love, they could not, and if they made the utmost efforts to repel it, they could not. Those who love God are those whom God loves. I fancied that I loved him, said Bayezid, but on consideration I saw that his love preceded mine. Junaid defined love as the substitution of the qualities of the beloved for the qualities of the lover. In other words, love signifies the passing away of the individual self. It is an uncontrollable rapture, a God-sent grace which must be sought by ardent prayer and aspiration.
O thou in whose bat well curved my heart like a ball is laid, nor ever a hairbreadth swerved from thy bidding, nor disobeyed. I have washed mine outward clean, the water I drew and poured. Mine inward is thy demesne. Do thou keep us stainless, Lord.
Jalaluddin teaches that man's love is really the effect of God's love by means of an apologue. One night a certain devotee was praying aloud when Satan appeared to him and said, "How long wilt thou cry, O Allah? Be quiet, for thou wilt get no answer." The devotee hung his head in silence. After a little while he had a vision of the prophet Qadir, who said to him, "Ah, why hast thou ceased to call on God?" "Because the answer, 'Here am I,' came not," he replied. Qadir said, "God hath ordered me to go to thee and say this. Was it not that I summoned thee to service? Did I not make thee busy with my name? Thy calling Allah was my 'Here am I.' Thy yearning pain, my messenger to thee. All of those tears and cries and supplications, I was the magnet, and I gave them wings."
Divine love is beyond description, yet its signs are manifest. Sari al-Sakati questioned Junaid concerning the nature of love. Some say, he answered, that this is a state of concord, and some say that it is altruism, and some say that it is so-and-so. Sari took hold of the skin on his forearm and pulled it, but it would not stretch. Then he said, "I swear by the glory of God, were I to say that this skin hath shriveled on this bone for love of him, I should be telling the truth." Thereupon he fainted away, and his face became like the shining moon. Love, the astrolabe of heavenly mysteries, inspires all religion worthy of the name, and brings with it not reasoned belief, but the intense conviction arising from immediate intuition. This inner light is its own evidence. He who sees it has real knowledge, and nothing can increase or diminish his certainty. Hence the Sufis never weary of exposing the futility of a faith which supports itself on intellectual proofs, external authority, self-interest, or self-regard of any kind. The bearing dialectic of the theologian, the canting righteousness of the Pharisee rooted in forms and ceremonies, the less crude but equally undisinterested worship of which the motive is desire to gain everlasting happiness in the life hereafter, the relatively pure devotion of the mystic who, although he loves God, thinks of himself as loving, and whose heart is not wholly emptied of otherness. All of these are veils to be removed. A few sayings by those who know will be more instructive than further explanation. O God, whatever share of this world thou hast allotted me, bestow it on thine enemies, and whatever share of the next world thou hast allotted to me, bestow it on thy friends. Thou art enough for me. Rabia. O God, if I worship thee in fear of hell, burn me in hell, and if I worship thee in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship thee for thine own sake, withhold not thine everlasting beauty. Rabia. Notwithstanding, the lovers of God are separated from him by their love. They have the essential thing, for whether they sleep or wake, they seek and are sought, and are not occupied with their own seeking and loving, but are enraptured in contemplation of the beloved.
It is a crime in the lover to regard his love, and an outrage in love to look at one's own seeking while one is face to face with the sought. Bayezid. His love entered and removed all besides him, and left no trace of anything else, so that it remains single, even as he is single. Bayezid.
To feel at one with God for a moment is better than all men's acts of worship, from the beginning to the end of the world. Shibli.
Fear of the fire, in contemplation with fear of being parted from the beloved, is like a drop of water cast into the mightiest ocean. Du al-Nun. Unless I have the face of my heart towards thee, I deem prayer unworthy to be reckoned as prayer. If I turn my face to the Kaaba, 'tis for love of thine. Otherwise I am quit both of prayer and Kaaba. Jalaluddin Rumi. Love, again, is the divine instinct of the soul, impelling it to realize its nature and destiny. The soul is the firstborn of God. Before the creation of the universe, it lived and moved and had its being in him. And during its earthly manifestation, it is a stranger in exile, ever pining to return to its home. This is love, to fly heavenward, to rend every instant 100 veils, the first moment to renounce life, the last step to fare without feet, to regard this world as invisible, not to see what appears to oneself. All the love romances and allegories of Sufi poetry, the tales of Layla and Majnun, Yusuf, Joseph, and Zuleika, Solomon and Absal, the moth and the candle, the nightingale and the rose, are shadow pictures of the soul's passionate longing to be reunited with God. It is impossible, in the brief space at my command, to give the reader more than a passing glimpse of the treasures which the exuberant fancy of the East has heaped together in every room of this enchanted palace. The soul is likened to a moaning dove that has lost her mate, to a reed torn from its bed and made into a flute whose plaintive music fills the eye with tears, to a falcon summoned by the fowler's whistle to perch again upon his wrist, to snow melting in the sun and mounting as vapor to the sky, to a frenzied camel swiftly plunging through the desert by night, to a caged parrot, a fish on dry land, a pawn that seeks to become a king. These figures imply that God is conceived as transcendent, and that the soul cannot reach him without taking what Plotinus in a splendid phrase calls the flight of the alone to the alone. Jalaluddin says, "The motion of every atom is towards its origin. A man comes to be the thing on which he is bent. By the attraction of fondness and yearning, the soul and the heart assume the qualities of the beloved, who is the soul of souls." A man comes to be the thing on which he is bent. What then does Sufi become? Eckhart, in one of his sermons, quotes the saying of St. Augustine that man is what he loves, and adds this comment: "If he loves a stone, he is a stone. If he loves a man, he is a man. If he loves God, I dare not say more. For if I said that, he would then be God. Ye might stone me." The Muslim mystics enjoyed greater freedom of speech than their Christian brethren who owed allegiance to the medieval Catholic Church, and if they went too far, the plea of ecstasy was generally accepted as a sufficient excuse. Whether they emphasize the outward toward the inward aspect of unification, the transcendence or the immanence of God, their expressions are bold and uncompromising. Thus, Abu Sa'id, "In my heart thou dwellest, else with blood I shall drench it. In mine eye thou glowest, else with tears I'll quench it. Only to be one with thee my soul desireth. else from out of my body, by hook or crook, I'll wrench it. Jalaluddin Rumi proclaims that the soul's love of God is God's love of the soul, and that in loving the soul, God loves himself, for he draws home to himself that which in its essence is divine. Our copper, says the poet, has been transmuted by this rare alchemy, meaning that the base alloy of self has been purified and spiritualized. In another ode he says, O my soul, I searched from end to end. I saw in thee naught save the beloved. Call me not infidel. O my soul, if I say that thou thyself art he. And yet more plainly, ye who in search of God pursue, ye need not search for God is you. Why seek ye something that was missing ne'er? Save you none is, but you are where? Oh, where? Where is the lover when the beloved has displayed himself? Nowhere and everywhere. His individuality has passed away from him. In the bridal chamber of unity, God celebrates the mystical marriage of the soul.